Good evening. When you plan an event 6 months in advance, and the topic is the Middle East, there's a better than even chance that events will take control of the agenda. And that's where we find ourselves tonight. We will indeed cover the current crisis in Gaza, but we will also look at the origins of this conflict, so you will have a better understanding not just of what is happening there, but why it is happening. We are all fortunate because we have a guide tonight who knows the terrain. Newspaper journalists, I believe, occupy an odd slot in our age of personality-driven media. Unlike television journalists, we don't know their faces, and unlike radio journalists, we are unfamiliar with their voices. All we know are those little black, bold letters that tell us their names. There are some names that stand out, the names that we tend to gravitate towards when we open our papers in the morning. And for the last 20 years, many of us have picked up the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and later the New York Sun. And when we saw the byline of Youssef Ibrahim, we knew we were about to read a story that would give us an informed point of view about a region that has baffled most Westerners for the past 70 years. You learn something when you read articles by Mr. Ibrahim. And when that keeps happening on a regular basis, you begin to understand it's not by accident. Part of this, or perhaps the biggest reason for this, is that Youssef comes from the region. He was born in Cairo, he grew up there, and he has lived throughout the Middle East. He speaks the language, and more importantly, he understands the nuances of this very complex part of the world. He is as comfortable on a street in Beirut or Riyadh or Tehran as you are on the Upper West Side. There is another reason that is also obvious and sadly not that common. Youssef Ibrahim is an honest observer of what he sees. He's also a gifted writer. Along the way, he has picked up a Polk Award, 2 Overseas Press Club Awards, so I cannot take full credit for recognizing his talents. Other people have as well. There is a true story that when Abe Rosenthal, the great editor of the Times, sent Youssef Ibrahim overseas on his first assignment in 1979, he wanted to ease him into that first assignment and give him a quiet place. So he sent him to Tehran 6 months before the Islamic Revolution. He handled it brilliantly. You can read Youssef's columns today on Pajamas Media, and I would suggest all of you do that. You're going to learn something. We are in for a great treat tonight. I want to thank the 92nd Street Y and camera for making all of this possible. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Youssef Ibrahim. Welcome.
Thank you.
I want to start at the beginning, and I would like you, please, if you will, to describe the neighborhood you grew up in and describe Cairo of the 1950s, perhaps the late 40s.
Thanks for mentioning my age, but what gives you an opportunity to say that I was actually 9 years old when a group of army officers took power in Cairo, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, and we began a whole new era in the history of and the culture and the fate and of the Arab world. In 1952, I was 9. I lived in a very nice suburb of Cairo called Zamalek, which is kind of best way to picture it is the Upper East Side was a lot more trees, a lot more parks, and many more nannies, actually. And
more nannies.
For upper middle class. by the river Nile, I was part of a family. My father was, at that point, had reached the status of general manager of the biggest department store in Egypt called Oroz Dibak, which was owned by one of the most important wealthy Jewish families in Egypt. And the biggest competitor actually was the other mega store, you can call them the Bloomingdale's and the Macy's, called Securiel, which is owned by another very wealthy Jewish family in Egypt. Both exist today, except they are, of course, property of the state. And I, like my father, my uncles, my brother, and my nephews eventually went to French Jesuits, which was one of the constellation of elite school, which included Victoria College. For those of you who, of course, remember Omar Sharif, that kind of his hangout, or King Hussein, for that matter. A lot of Arabs, in fact, came to Egypt for their education, which was not only for the upper middle class, but for the middle class, a foreign education. We had French schools, German schools, Lycée Français, Sacré-Cœur, you name it. The Jesuits was a pretty distinctive one. Cairo and Zamalek was the kind of neighborhood where, in our building, for example, we had across the hall an Italian family. It's one of these, again, to bring it into perspective, what you would call here pre-war glamorous 4- or 5-bedroom kind of places. Not uncommon at all. If you go today, there's still, the old Cairo is still pretty much 18th, 19th century fantastic buildings from, dating all the way back to the British occupation and the French influence, et cetera, et cetera. It was very common first of all, at the Jesuits, which I joined at age 6 until age 18, not really hard labor, I must tell you. In the first 6 years, we were actually fined the equivalent of 1 cent for speaking anything other than French. The idea of this is just to give you a flavor of not an exclusive part of Egyptian society, but in a majority of actually the middle class. Got to think of the city at the time as perhaps 3 million people. Compare it to today, a metropolis of 19 million people that's completely out of control. Got to think of it as dotted with a lot of parks and pleasant places. Eventually, by the time I joined the American University in Cairo to start my undergraduate studies, we had moved to Heliopolis. Now, Heliopolis was a fairly new neighborhood that was charted, planned in the same style of Boulevard Haussmann, Parisian Haussmann architecture, huge cut boulevards, wide open vistas. And Heliopolis, the neighborhood we moved into, was planned by one of the very famous, well-known architect, European, Belgian aristocrat called the Baron Ambin, whose palace is still there in Heliopolis. So you get the idea of this Levantine multicultural city where, in my building anyway, my mother conversed in Italian with the Italian neighbor, but and it wasn't unusual at all to hear Greek, Arabic, of course, Egyptian Arabic. And you could navigate in this culture with the country club, but I don't want you to be tempted to think that we're talking about a very elite society. The Egyptian countryside was pretty wealthy. You got to remember, in the 50s and until the 60s, even into the early 70s, Egypt was essentially an agricultural country, and its main product is still the best cotton in the world. Cotton is a huge industry that brought a lot of prosperity to Egypt. The religious structure of Egypt, I mean...
I was going to ask you that. There were Muslims, there were Christians, there were Jews.
Armenians and Greeks. I mean, up until the Nasser movement kicked in ferociously, especially in 1956 when there was one of the second war, actually. 1948 would be the first war with Israel. 56 would be the second war with Israel, France, and Britain. Up until 1956, Egypt was a multicultural country. And it was not very similar, actually, to other Arab countries, which today we look upon as real problems. There were major cultures in the Arab world, or civilizational pillars. Lebanon was one of them. Iraq was another. And this model I'm describing of foreign schools, multilingual abilities, a huge cultural traffic that crosses religious lines and crosses identity, was very prevalent in these places. Of course, these are the same places we have all seen, in which we have seen a collapse or a surrender, if you like, to Islamic fundamentalism, which is the subject we'll get into.
So the world you're describing seems like another world.
Anybody, all of you who read Alexander Durrell's sort of books, it's that kind of world. And if you haven't caught that, there is a colleague of mine at the Wall Street Journal, Luced Lagdano, who came out last year with a magnificent book called The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit, who was about her father and her family, and it was our voyage out of Egypt as a Jewish family. And she captures that atmosphere in a splendid way. Another way of capturing it is, we of course, there was a lot of intermarriage, and it went both ways. There were certainly a lot of Muslims who married Christians. In my own family, my uncle, my father's brother, was married to a Jewish person. And they both lived, she and her sister lived in the neighborhood that Lagdano actually has written her entire book about, Azahar. So you got to picture this very cosmopolitan city indeed, with all its tribes, its various tribes, all united really by first some prosperity, significant amount of prosperity, not for Cairo only, but for the whole country. The fact that Egypt was the leading country in the region, and the fact that it actually was the leading Islamic country, but propagating and nurturing a kind of Islam that's hardly recognizable today. A secularist, oriented, moderate Islam. We'll get back into this.
What is the demarcation, the dates, the events when that Islam changed and the radical Islam that is the subject of tonight?
There are several dates, but if you want a date, a super date, I would say 1928, for a reason nobody actually knows or realizes, because this was the year the organization, which has since become known as the Muslim Brotherhood, was established by the famous Ted Koppel, who was hanged by Nasser in 1960, when the Islamists began to clash with Nasser. For me personally, there is a dramatic date, which is 1952. In 1952, after the Nasser Army Officers Group came to power, the Muslim Brotherhood, which had then grown to a substantial power between the years 1928 and 1952, set Cairo on fire. And guess what was their first targets? Securel, the department store, and Rozdibak, the department store, and the movie theaters like Metro and Rivoli, and all the symbols of this Western modernization that was pretty much the hallmark of Egypt. And the date is very dramatic because as they were running around, literally it's like Rome burning. Half of downtown Cairo is going on fire. My father is frantically coming to get me out of the Jesuit, which was downtown Cairo, and my mother was picking up my sister, who was at the German school, and you're navigating in a taxi with these Islamist mobs running around. But Nasser immediately then took the position that this is terrorism that's not to be tolerated, and for the next, from 56 all the way to the time really that the next date, the next important date came about, 1967, the year of the most massive defeat of several Arab countries and Arab armies by Israel. It was the Nasserites, the Arab nationalism against these Islamist extremists. And when 67 came and there was this huge defeat for the Egyptian army, it eventually led to another important date, which is the arrival of Anwar Sadat on the scene. Of course, what we were doing is exchanging army generals slowly for mosques, sheikhs, and that process took a while, but Sadat facilitated that process by, in fact, taking the position that he is an Islamist president and introducing Sharia law in the Egyptian constitution as the foundation of refashioning all Egyptian laws. The Islamists, led by the Muslim Brotherhood, have exploited this and proceeded with the Islamization of Egypt based on the law, actually, since then. But that's an important date when Sadat was killed. And he was killed by the same guys, by the Islamic fundamentalists, for having made peace with Israel. I mean, I think what Sadat did and what we saw in the streets of Egypt and the way it manifested itself, I will tell you in a second, is to substitute the Nasserites, socialist, Arab nationalists, putting those in jail and taking out of jail all the Muslim brotherhoods, who eventually killed him and proceeded to use the laws he put in place to Islamize Egypt. So slowly you began to see, first under Nasser, the Greeks and the Italians and certainly the Jews began to leave. It was forced, it was intimidation, but it was also partly the massive nationalization of all the private sector. The place this mega store, the Bloomingdale's my father ran, became a state property. Lands were massively expropriated. The entire structure of the society began to change from essentially private enterprise to a massive state-run, overlaid with this leader of the Arab world. The quest, certainly the British were seen out twice, first in 52, and then when they came back, 56, again by the international community this time. And it wasn't the Egyptianization of Egypt. Certainly the Jesuits were told, if you ever dare fine kids anymore for speaking Arabic, we are going to shut you down. And the Jesuits and the Victoria College and all these schools were nationalized for a while. They never really returned to the old glory of the kind of Eton-like education, but they were given back. But the points where the breaks happened are those years. Of course, 73 war was the next war, and that was an important thing, giving Sadat legitimacy, and then he was killed. And now we have the third army general who is running Egypt, except he's been around for almost since 81, right? Mm-hmm. Mubarak. And he's preparing his son. So this country, Egypt, which was a pleasantly corrupt monarchy, with a lot of, elasticity, tolerance, live and let live kind of attitude, slowly began first to become, are you an Arab nationalist or a Nasserite or not? If you're not, you're out. And then after Sadat's death, Mubarak, I think, surrendered to, are you an Islamist or not? And you can be an Islamist as long as you don't oppose Mubarak. And that's kind of where we are now. The same bargain actually happened across the board everywhere else. You look at Jordan, King Hussein first, and then his son now surrendered the street to the Islamists, provided the Islamists recognized that the military and an enormous, formidable security state is going to prevent you from taking power. Just one illustration of this, and it's a mind-boggling one. When you look at the Egyptian police security infrastructure, we are not talking about the army. We're just talking about the people who constitute the three main branches of the police: the simple police force, the guys you see in the street in uniforms, the state security, which is like the FBI, and the central security, which is combination FBI, CIA. This is just a police force. The combination of these three adds up, as of last year, to 1.1 million people, uniformed, non-uniformed, paid by the state. Put this in perspective, Egypt is 85 million people.
There was another date that we talked about that you actually witnessed. It was 1979, as a demarcation for the radicalization.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, we did talk about this, but there are several things that happened in 1979. I think, first of all, there was the constant. I mean, once Egypt moved from tightening the space on the officially not desirable minorities. Jews left, the Greeks were pushed out, the Italians were pushed out. I mean, when I say Jews, Greeks, and Italians, I'm talking about Jewish Egyptians, Greek Egyptians, Italian Egyptians. We're talking about, people who make up this multicultural society. I think that what was left and what is still left is, of course, the largest Christian minority in the Arab world. I mean, you have 10 million Copts in Egypt. And things like, the tightening, the Sharia law seeping into Egyptian law, which is probably things you heard about. You can build a mosque anywhere you want because Al-Azhar and its power is overwhelming, but you cannot fix a window in a church, literally, without a presidential decree. So this is like become a symbolic, the symbolic sort of, if you like, nail in the officially sanctioned persecution. You began to see, while in 1973, when Sadat waged the war against Israel, the commander of the Egyptian Second Army, which led the assault, was an Egyptian Christian. Today, it would be impossible for Christians to actually be accepted in the army. Forget about ministerial posts. There are 2 token ministerial posts. But I don't want to reduce this to an issue of persecution of minorities, because I think the most awful thing that actually happened was the persecution of the Muslim secular society. The steady loss of every anchor that ties anybody who wants to be a moderate Muslim to any semblance of moderation.
So here's the question that is coming up. You describe this wonderful world, this secular world, where there are different religions, and even within the Muslim world, there can be people who practice and people who are secular. What was it about the Brotherhood that started in 1928 for no apparent reason? What was it within the societies throughout the Middle East that attracted so many people to this movement?
Well, the most important thing is the collapse of the previous model. And the previous model was, we're going to get rid of foreign occupation, we're going to seek independence, which not only Egypt, not even the Arab world, but much of the third world shared. It was the period where the last vestiges of colonialism were collapsing, including in Black Africa and so on and so forth. And that model was a rising model until it clashed with the emptiness of its own slogans, and the clash was humongously dramatic because of this unbelievable defeat of 1967. I think you all know that already, that it has a name. It's called the year of the Nakba or the Naksa, which doesn't even translate well if you say just catastrophe. It's more than this. It was a moment of trying to face reality in the most brutal way, and it even for us, I was 9 years old when they all started, and I certainly became an enthusiastic Arab nationalist. In fact, I was leading a firebrand at the American University in Cairo on the morning of June 7, 1967, June 5, 1967, when the Israelis came and we were supposed to go get our guns, for which we're not really trained to use, at the sporting club. And there weren't any guns. And then 2 days later, the army was returning through Heliopolis, our new neighborhood, because that's the way coming from the Suez Canal. Broken, was burnt car and so on. It took us 3 years to digest it. By 1969, the model had collapsed. And the only other model, because in typical dictatorship, be it Syria, Algeria, you take your pick, Yemen, when the Arab nationalist model collapsed, the only other model that the Muslim Brotherhood had worked on assiduously since 1928 was the grassroots model. You work the neighborhood mosque, you get in people through madrasas. Of course, Saudi Arabia played a major role there, and still today Saudi Arabia plays a huge role in funding these hundreds of madrasas in Pakistan, which are, of course, the places where you do two things. You learn the Quran by rote, to recite it, and then you're ready for Osama bin Laden to come and pick you up as a volunteer. And in Egypt, this process was happening, but it was happening in a way it's much more clever and much more distressing, because Egypt was the font of secular, enlightened Islam. And the heart of this font was the most famous theological institute in the world, the Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar University was to produce thinkers who interpreted Islam. And I think the process that the Muslim Brotherhood built up very successfully, essentially it is the Saudi model, is what we know today is the Sunni fundamentalist or Islamic fundamentalist. You do not interpret, you just follow Islam. And the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood was Islam is the solution. The Muslim Brotherhood, which produced Hamas and produced Jihad Islami and eventually produced the Iranian Revolution of 1979. I now remembered what you meant to ask.
Sorry, I should have been more specific.
Warren was asking what happened in '79, and I'll answer it immediately. But the model that came in was then that it was a slogan: Islam is the solution. We were defeated by Israel. Our economies collapsed. Our culture is becoming bankrupt, and only Islam is the solution. It's almost like a Band-Aid, but it's more than a Band-Aid. It's a Band-Aid with Valium. It's very pleasant. You don't have to question anything else. Islam is the solution. Now, what happened in '79, of course, was I landed in Iran 6 months before as the New York Times bureau chief, because Abe Rosenthal at the time thought he was giving me a break. You've done well on the business desk, and we want to try you, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to put you in this quiet place. And '79, of course, what happened is Ayatollah, Ruhollah, Khomeini finally landed in Iran. And I was there in Iran. And what really happened in Iran that contributed and took all this change I'm describing to the next level is here you had a major religious authority. And Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was not a negligible quantity. And 100 years from now, when we will really look at history, we are looking, in the end of the day, at a significant scholar with 15 books of writing, and a demagogue and a man who was absolutely determined to officially, on the ground, apply Islam as the solution as a political regime. And he took over a country. He took over a country with an army, with a police, a sophisticated country that the Shah of Iran was actually constructing, and more importantly, the other branch of Islam, Shiite Islam, in a nation which was another one of those what I called pillars of civilization in the Middle East. Iran, country with 5,000 years of civilization. Egypt, another 5,000 years of civilization.
But also a very westernized country.
Totally westernized, just like Egypt was. And suddenly a superstructure of mullahs came on. I have a view, which I think some of you probably are aware of. There are fundamental differences between Shiite Islam and Sunni Islam. We've learned more about it lately because they've both been killing each other for the last 5 years. Shiite Islam is broke away from Sunni Islam over a complete divergence over who's supposed to be the successor to the Prophet. But the Shiite Islam major dispute with Sunni Islam is the Shiites allow and encourage what is called ijtihad, which is interpretation. And the biggest interpretation of all was Ayatollah Khomeini, who reinterpreted Iranian Islam as the right to revolution, the right to rule in the name of religion, which really kind of was the last nail in secular Islam. Until then, there was still a modicum of existence for secular Islam. You can be a Muslim, you don't have to pray 5 times a day, you can intermarry, you don't have to hate infidels, you're not locked in an eternal fight with anybody who's not Muslim. And it kind of added to the groundwork that has been assiduously put there by the Muslim Brotherhood.
There is a vignette I'd like to share with the audience because I found it fascinating when we were speaking backstage. There is also a split personality that is going on in the region, and it was exemplified in a flight that I once took from Saudi Arabia to Cairo. Now, Saudi Arabia is the country that has the holiest sites of Islam on its soil. It's the country that sends the Wahhabi religion, the madrasas, throughout the world, pays for them. On the flight that I was taking, it was filled with Saudis who were going to Cairo the way most New Yorkers go to Las Vegas. This was back in the 80s. And then you told me about a flight. And I'd like you to share that with the audience.
Well, I was based in Paris for 10 years to cover the Middle East. It's very convenient, of course. But I mean, if you have to spend, trust me, 2 weeks in Libya, you really want to come back to Boulevard Osman. And the Times was fine with that. Then I was based in London also for 7 years. And from Paris, it's a vivid map because I used to go to Saudi Arabia a lot. Is when you take a flight in Paris, back in those days, both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times were extremely wealthy newspapers. So we traveled in the comfortable part of the cabin. And
this is another part of the world that has changed.
This has changed. And there is a phenomenon when the pilot says, you're getting into Paris, and there's all these extraordinary good-looking women. I mean, some of these Saudi women are very chic, very wealthy, very well-dressed, tight blue jeans, tight sweaters, all of that stuff. And when the pilot says, ladies and gentlemen, we're entering Saudi space, this is a procession in front of the toilet of these women, and they, with their big abaya, black robe, and they come out in this black tent look, and the funereal air settles on the cabin, and it's a freaks you out. No matter how many times you've seen it, the exact contrary thing happens on the flight out. You're in Riyadh, you're in the plane, this funeral around the first class cabin is raining because that's where all the people who are Saudis are traveling. I mean, the expatriate help, who are mostly Filipinos, they travel in the tourist class. So, and on the way out, you have this funeral, and then the moment the guy says, we're leaving Saudi space, there is the same line, and suddenly this gorgeous, long-haired, the perfumes begin to float in the cabin. And I asked several of my best Saudi friends, and I quoted this to Warren the other day, one of them, who is a very senior minister in the cabinet, who himself, his wife is a doctor educated in Egypt, and he's been planning and oil minister for 35 years, says, but we're comfortable in these two worlds. And of course, when you engage this conversation, in the end of the day, you reach the conclusion that no, you're not comfortable, because in the middle is a huge space that allows you to have things like bin Laden's. Because in the middle, between the trip from this to the trip from that, and the trip from there to the trip back, you can look upon a guy like bin Laden, who comes from the most distinguished second family after the royal family in Saudi Arabia, for many years as a good Muslim, even when he's killing Christians, because somehow it's forgivable. It's part of his transition back and forth. Only when he decided that Saudi Arabia itself should be overthrown and that the royal family itself should be overthrown did he become a bad guy. And not even then. After 9/11, you all remember, our president, this president, allowed 52 members of the bin Laden family to take the only plane that was flying out of the United States on the 12th of September. Because there is this idea that it's a good family, but in the process of this, half of this family, half of the royal family, are funding those madrasas in Pakistan. They cannot make the mental leap between what you are doing and what the outcome is, and somehow in the middle, it's all good for Islam.
I want to get to the questions from the audience, but there's just one, I think, important other factor that I just wanted to get a brief comment from you. The impact of satellite television, Arab satellite television on the Middle East.
The French would say foudroyant, like being hit by thunder. Al Jazeera, of course, the very first and the most explosive by far, copied CNN, but delivered the station to the Muslim Brotherhood. You have to go see Al Jazeera. More importantly, you have to go to Qatar. Again, going back to the contradictions we are talking about. Al Jazeera is totally funded by the Qatari royal family, which is one of our closest allies and friends, and major suppliers of natural gas, by the way, to the world. And it costs, there is no advertising in Al Jazeera. It's not a commercial station. So we're talking about, we're talking about 250, 300, maybe $500 million a year. It's been there for 10 years. It's incendiary in its anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, anti-modernism, and its adherence to the Muslim Brotherhood. And you go visit Al Jazeera, then you take your car with your driver and drive for 2 kilometers, less than a mile, a little bit, and you're in Central Command, our most important United States military strategic region of the Middle East. And the contrast between the two, you're sitting, I've been there several times to talk, and you're sitting with a U.S. general, and you say, General, do you realize what Al Jazeera is just saying about occupation forces in Iraq and the atrocities Americans are committing, and et cetera, et cetera? Some of it, of course, is perfectly objective reporting, Abu Ghraib, et cetera, but the commentary is incendiary. And I had one Army general say to me, it's a small place. In many ways, the Americans are also on vacation, because he says it's a small place, we can occupy it with a fax. And that's true. If the U.S. Central Command sent a fax to the emir saying you're under occupation, they don't even have to put 12 soldiers in a truck. It's done. And there is this contradiction. I mean, this is the same place that's in love with America, And but you see the sheikh when he's there in his white robes, and when he's at the UN, he's wearing a Pierre Cardin suit with a downhill tie, and he sees no contradictions between having this incendiary station there. But it's not only Al Jazeera, or frankly. I mean, I was listening to NPR yesterday. There's a program called The World. There's a woman called Jeb, what's her name? Jeb something, yesterday, and she was hosting, I'll find it here. She was hosting a program on Gaza. And one of her guests was a fellow who used to be a friend of mine, Professor Rashid Khaldi of Columbia University. And Rashid...
Formerly of the University of Chicago.
Formerly University of Chicago. Yeah. And Rashid was saying, but Hamas has proposed to discuss with Israel, has proposed to have a deal with Israelis several times. And he said it 3 times, and the anchor person did not raise any objection. Now, it's not really a vast stretch to expect an anchor person to know that the charter of Hamas, the constitution of Hamas, in its 2nd article, totally reject not only a Jewish state, but Jews as people with whom you can talk. So there are things like this. Nick, I've been watching CNN International, which is different from what we tend to watch here, which is CNN with Wolf Blitzer, etc. CNN International is a different animal, but that's what much of the world is seeing. I've been watching their correspondent. I mean, Nick Robertson has been sitting there moaning about, about proportional, what do we call it? Proportional response. Now, I mean, Warren is coming up with a book about General Curtis LeMay, who is not a guy who believed in proportional response. And proportional response is, I mean, don't get me wrong. I am an Arab, and my distress is about how Islamic fundamentalism has destroyed the Arab world. It is not an infatuation with Israel that's misplaced. I have my criticism of Israel, but that is not the bigger issue we have here. I mean, there's no way a country like Israel can even consider having a dialogue with Hamas. It's an organization that's nihilist. It's an organization that it's not for this purpose. It's simply a definition of reality. The same thing goes with the Muslim Brotherhood, really. I mean, when the Muslim Brotherhood, if and when, I think when more than if, takes over from the Mubaraks in Egypt, that is the next stage where we're going to, where it will demand the abolition of the peace treaty with Israel. The peace treaty with Israel, 79, and the next peace treaty with Jordan are landmarks. They changed the strategic picture. But that's where Hamas wants to go, and where the Muslim Brotherhood. And even if Hamas, which it will in the next few days, accept a ceasefire with Israel, and it will, it has to, within a year, Jihad Islami will come out of Gaza and say, but we didn't agree to that. And so there is no, you can't, it's like trying to talk to, the Nazi ideology to explain that perhaps you can have a dialogue with Jews. It's impossible by definition.
Let me read some of the questions, and we can go through them as quickly as possible so the audience can have some participation as well. Given the Arab-Israeli birth rate and an arguably flawed land for peace architecture, divided land, wouldn't it be wiser to aim for a united pan-Semitic land, secular and democratic?
If you think it's possible, I think it's virtually impossible. FYI, I was watching Charlie Rose last night, and he had Bob Simon, And Bob Simon's coming up with a piece on 60 Minutes Sunday, which answers your question with a simple
Not my
one
question,
word.
their question.
Or their question, no. It will never happen. It cannot happen. Israel has a serious problem because I personally no longer think there is a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli issue, because it's become, these things that Madoff and all these crazy guys on Wall Street put together, the complicated derivative, whatever that the banks were selling to each other. Well, the Israeli-Palestinian question has become one of those. When you sit down at the table now, if you are a Palestinian and you want to talk to the Israelis, you are carrying with you these derivatives, which are called the Iranian position, because Iran supports Hamas, and the Hezbollah position, because Hezbollah supports Hamas, and Hezbollah is both Iran and Syria. So the derivatives now is there isn't really only a Palestinian-Israeli issue. There is a Palestinian-Syrian Pakistani, because the Pakistani guys totally reject any concept of talking to Jews. All of these things have become part of what the Americans, for example, are going to have to handle. And if Obama, who's coming in, thinks, oh, we can work something out, he, of course, will have to work in a deal with Iran on not harassing them, but having a nuclear weapon, because that's really now a derivative composed and attached to the Palestinian issue. Hamas charter says it doesn't want a Palestinian state. Hamas charter says it wants an Islamic caliphate state. It is not striving for the old Palestine that even Yasser Arafat was trying to get. It is going beyond that.
This is really a bleak picture, and I don't want to send our audience.
No, but there is a solution.
That's where
There
I was
is a
going
solution, which is honestly no solution. For the simple meaning, let me put it this way. I know everybody is obsessed because all the academics in America now, and of course the Obama team, and much of the media is into this mantra that no solution of any of our Mideast problems is possible before we resolve the Israeli-Palestinian question. That's total nonsense. The situation in Iraq, not for reasons that many of you may have in mind, not to protect Israel, but because the Iraqi problem essentially at this point is a situation where the Sunnis and Shiites have to decide how to devise a country in which they can live together. The Arab massive poverty problem, was 80% of the population now being young people who are deprived of jobs, the huge corruption across the concept of the failed state, which we all mention a lot, but actually are living through. Pakistan is a failed state now. And you will hear a lot of people in Pakistan telling you that in Afghanistan is a problem. And I've hearing the last few days quite a few commentators saying, if we resolve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, it'll be so much easier to tackle the Iraqi problem than to talk to Iran and then to talk to, and that's nonsense. The Israeli-Palestinian problem, if you want a real date on it, which we didn't mention, it's 1919, the Balfour Declaration. We are in 2009. That's 100 years. It hasn't been solved. It's not going to be solved. And what we are going to have is more of the same. There will be periods of explosions. It used to be wars with states, But you don't see Jordan or Egypt or Syria even waging a war anymore. You see Hezbollah and Hamas waging a war. After you pacify Hezbollah and Hamas, Hezbollah, until yesterday, wasn't shooting rockets. I'm beginning to notice today they were shooting some rockets. I'm not so sure they're going to participate in this war because they got in quite a beating. And Israel got quite a beating in 2006. So the solution, Warren, is going to be this solution. There will never be, it's too late. We're way past the point of two-state solution. It's over. What we are going to have now is perhaps we can raise the standard of the West Bank to a point where it can live forever as a kind of protected within Israel. There are far too many settlers to begin with on the West Bank, 300,000 now, to reverse the situation. So really, this is the solution. What you see is what you're going to have.
A continuation of what we see every day.
It is impossible to have another one.
And we have one question here about in 12 days we're going to have a new president. Any chance for any new?
I find it very amusing. I think I mentioned this to you over our kind of coffee the other day. Obama has given like 6 press conferences so far as a president-elect. He's spoken, today he's speaking about the economy and this and that, and yet on this issue, there's only one answer. There's only one president at a time. Now, he has no problem being 2 presidents at a time, all the time, on all the other issues. And I think it just tells you that Obama and all his advisors, and he's got very good ones, starting with Hillary, are telling him this is the mother of all problems. And you don't want to step into this. And of course, I suspect Obama did say at some point that he learned a lot about Palestine at the table of Rashid Khaldi and his wife, Mona. I suspect Obama has got a strong disposition to be sympathetic to the Palestinians. Everybody should have a strong disposition to have sympathetic to Palestinians. I didn't mean in any of my comments to suggest that they have no rights. They are an oppressed people who have missed their opportunity many, many times because of their behavior and because of the Israeli behavior, because we do have the settler movement on the other side of this. But, you know, things happen. I'm not going to use the other word. Things happen. This is how it is. And it's too late to reverse this process. Obama may come in with all the idealistic enthusiasm and perhaps the impact of all those meals he had at the Khaledi's home, but it doesn't change anything. To begin with, I don't believe it is possible to have an American president under any circumstances who would do what needs to be done. Only 2 presidents did it, Carter and Bush Sr. And they both basically, what is demanded now is to force Israel to do the kind of things because of everything we discussed here. It simply can no longer do. In other words, arm twist Israel. And in the world, America, 2009, I don't think an American president, even Obama, can do that.
Did Israel have any other choice than to take the actions it is currently taking in Gaza? And how do you believe this will end? Well, I think you answered the second one, but did it have any choice?
Roughly, it's rough. It's very violent. It's going to be violent. There are going to be victims. And the Hezbollah eventually will make trouble. It is Friedman, who's my colleague at the Times, coined the phrase, it's a rough neighborhood. It's going to stay a rough neighborhood.
Why is hatred of Jews so central to Islamic fundamentalism?
Well, to begin with, it's in the Quran. I mean, we can't dance around it. If you take any number of verses in the Quran, they are specifically addressing both Christian and Jews in the most vile terms. The Quran also has many verses and many chapters which are idyllic in terms of coexistence, but it's always under an Islamic state, is always as dhimmis, is always as guests of the state. That's the kindest form of acceptance of infidels. The other form is, of course, war.
How much are American Islamic groups such as CARE and ISNA connected to the Muslim Brotherhood today?
Very. I think CARE is actually the official chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. And I think what worries me more than anything else is how the Islamic pools of American communities are abandoning almost their national origins to become Islamic organizations. In other words, this country has perhaps 3 million Arab Americans. And thanks with the Saudi influence and the constant pumping of money, welcomed by Washington, D.C., by the way. I mean, half of Washington, D.C. are lobbyists working for the Saudis, the other half may be working for Israel. But in America, there is something called a Jewish community. In other words, there is a grassroots explanation for the attachment to Israel. There is absolutely no Saudi community in this country, and yet half of Washington, D.C., look at former congressmen, look at every former American ambassador to Saudi Arabia. They are now making a very good amount of money, consultants, business, etc. In other words, you know, this has been a kind of takeover, and it's not seen by the Congress. And my problem is this Arab American community is being redefined only in one dimension: Muslim community.
There's also a former president we just saw recently in that group, well paid.
I don't know. Did you see this picture yesterday of the 4-5 presidents?
Yes.
Did you see the body language? Because there were 4 who were very close to each other and one who kind of stood a little bit aside.
I was actually not referring to him.
Which one were you?
I was referring to President Clinton, who...
Oh, President Clinton will swing both ways.
Yeah. We only have time for just a couple more questions. Will Islam ever accept a Jewish state in the Middle East?
No, categorically.
Okay, that's quick. That leads to a number of other questions, but I don't think we're going to have time for that. Can Israel defeat Islamic terrorism in its midst, and in the surrounding Arab countries? Will it ever?
It will take years, Warren. It will take years. We are going through an evolution. I mean, to put it in perspective, frankly, Christianity has gone through horrible atrocities. But we're talking about the 12th and 13th centuries, Inquisition, etc. I mean, these were the periods where Christianity was, I'm Christian, by the way, savage religion. Judaism has gone through its purgatory, 5,000 years. I don't think I need to speak about this very much. Both religions have their extremists today. I mean, the Jewish settler movement in Israel is a pretty cruel movement. And the evangelist movement here is pretty crazy. But in here, as in Israel, to some extent, to a lesser extent, but in here, it is contained by the wider, huge, effervescent democracy that America is. So we can absorb, you can absorb that stuff. You can absorb crazies in every direction because there is a far more process of democracy and life going on. In Israel, the settlers have a wider space, and everybody knows that Israeli society itself is extremely secular and very critical of its widening segment of religious Jews. They don't serve in the army, etc., etc. You know all of the criticism. In Islam, it's still the youngest religion, and the most tragic part of all of this, it is going into its effervescent killer period. It will not last because the Arab and Muslim societies themselves will eventually resist it. But eventually means, not maybe even in our lifetime. These cycles take 30, 40 years. The descent of Egypt and Iraq and Lebanon from civility in multicultural societies to darker societies itself took 30 years. To get out of it, I think you're not looking at it tomorrow.
Before we stop, you have to give us something positive.
The positive thing is us, the United States, and Western Europe. And I mean, for me, you read in all these editorials and commentary about how horrible the United States is, and then you go to a place like Cairo or Jakarta or Amman, Jordan, and you go up to the American embassy at 4 a.m. and you will see a queue that runs for 1.5 miles by people who are standing there to ask for a visa. In fact, there is an industry now in Jordan and Syria, et cetera, where you hire people to go stand in line, which starts at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then you come in at 6 to take over from the person you hired to get in line. And for all the talking, everybody, I mean, how many people standing in line to immigrate to China or to Russia? And in every country in the world, you have millions of people who are standing in line to get a green card. So maybe a horrible imperialistic country, but it still stands as the place where you can come to Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, where my brother lives, and put up a mosque. And that's what's happening. And the same guys who are there, the taxi driver who was taking me back from Bay Ridge the other day, was the Muslim Brotherhood newspaper on his front seat, gives it to me to read it. And he's got it, and he's reading it, and he's talking about America until you get to the bridge, and you say, why did you come? He says, a better opportunity. And in the end, he is going through the stage, but what's his kids gonna be like? I don't think in the end of the day they're gonna be burning, embassies or demonstrating like this thing I showed you, the sign from Times Square the other day. In Times Square, we had a demonstration by people who are pro-Hamas. One of them is one of these guys who are the drivers who bring me back from Bay Ridge. Typical look, beard, galabeya, and he had a big sign that says, what was it?
Kill
all the Jews. Guice,
like orange juice.
Now his son is gonna be able to spell Jews correctly, but I don't think he will be carrying signs saying "kill the Jews."
Youssef, we barely touched the surface here.
It's a big subject.
It's a start, and I thank you so much, and I thank all of you for joining us. Thank you.